Hello. This week we are going to focus on our reading from the book of Hebrews. It includes part of what is sometimes known as the Hebrews Hall of Fame or the Hebrews Hall of Faith. There is a list of people, some named, some not, whose great faith is seen as an example for others to follow. Inspirational people, all before Jesus' time, who did amazing things for God and in God's name. Just some examples from the list. The Israelites who stepped out in faith into the gap in the Red Sea so that they could escape Egypt and enter the Promised Land. Rahab, who risked her own safety by hiding those that God wanted to protect. King David, prophets and others who endured torture and even death in the course of following God. And just before this passage, we hear about some of the other Hebrew heavyweights of faith, including Noah, Abraham, and Moses. We're told that despite their amazing faith, they didn't get to experience all that God had promised because they lived before Jesus did. And then at the start of chapter 12, we're reminded that those who have gone before us are a great crowd of witnesses, like a crowd of faithful followers of God who are cheering us on as we run the race of life. Now, this year we timed our summer holiday very well and were away for almost the entire duration of the Commonwealth Games. I didn't do a lot of exercise while we were away, but I certainly watched a lot of sport. As it was a home games for us, so many of the athletes from the home nations spoke of the amazing support that they had from the crowd cheering them on in whatever sport they were doing. And even the athletes from other Commonwealth nations said how supportive the crowds were. I remember watching one swimming race where a swimmer from another country was a long way behind everyone else. Still good enough to swim for his country though. And the crowd, obviously mostly from this country, were roaring to cheer him on in that final length. Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 says this: "Let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us." So with that in mind, this is a sermon in 3 races. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do any exercise yourself. Now, unfortunately, copyright means that I can't include the video clips in my sermon recording. But if you want to see what I'm talking about, then a quick YouTube search should show them to you. The first example I'm going to use is a race from this year's Commonwealth Games, with Ailish McColgan trying to do what her mum Liz did and win gold in the 10,000 metres. At various points in the race, she was ahead. But when the lead runners got to the final lap, she was in second place. You could see the pain and determination on her face in those final few hundred metres. And the commentator commented on how much the crowd were cheering her on. I must admit that I was shouting a little bit at the TV too at that point. And she did overtake the Kenyan runner to win gold and set a new games record for the event. The joy on her face as she realised that she had won was brilliant. And afterwards, in an interview, she said how much the cheering crowd, and knowing that her family were cheering her on too, helped her keep going and dig in that little bit deeper to overtake right when she needed to. We'll never know, but that extra support from the crowd might have been the difference between her winning gold and silver. That's what this passage is talking about. We have the faithful followers of God who have gone before us, cheering us on from heaven. And we can have the encouragement of other Christians now too. And just as Ailish was inspired by having her family there supporting her, we're told that we can look to Jesus. In Ailish's family, it was her mum who was the pioneer in that family in winning gold in 10,000 metres. For us, Jesus was the pioneer, opening the way to heaven. The next race I'm going to talk about is another one from the Commonwealth Games. This time, the women's 4x400 metres final. England and Scotland were both in the race, so it was an important one for the home nations. And before, there was speculation that we might do rather well, as the English team included those who had come second, third and fourth in the individual 400 metre final. When it came to the final lap, we had a good lead, but Canada was closing in all the time, and as Jessie Knight crossed the line for England, so did the Canadian runner. It went to a photo finish, with England winning by 100th of a second due to a well-timed dip on the line. Celebrations followed. It was the first time England had won that event in 28 years. But it was short-lived, as it soon emerged that our runners had gone out of lane in the first handover and we were disqualified. Sometimes, despite all the cheering and encouragement, we go out of lane as well. We make mistakes, we get things wrong, we mess up. Instead of celebrations, we feel like we should hang our heads in shame. Now, sadly for the women's 4x400 team, there was no second chance. Not for another 4 years until we get to Victoria anyway. But for us, in our lives, in following Jesus, we're not stripped of the prize for one mistake, or even for many mistakes. Which brings me to the third race. This time it isn't from the Commonwealth Games. We have to go a little bit further back. This race took place in 2016 in Mexico as part of the World Triathlon Series. Johnny Brownlee had a strong lead approaching the finish, but he had heat stroke and his body started shutting down. His legs went wobbly and he lost his sense of direction. It's quite difficult to watch, to be honest. Before he reaches the finish line, he is caught up by those in second and third place. One of those runners is his brother, Alistair. The other person keeps running and takes first place, but Alistair basically drags his brother to the finish line and then chucks him over as he collapses. You're not allowed to be supported over the finish line in that race, which is why Alistair pushes him over. Johnny comes second and Alistair gets third. Alistair could certainly have come second and possibly first if he'd just carried on running. But instead, he sacrifices his own success for his brother. Jesus' sacrifice for us on the cross means that we can keep running the race of life even when we mess up. Jesus helps us to the finish line through the sacrifices he made for us. As others cheer us on, he is ready to carry us when we need it, welcoming us across the finish line into heaven, where he is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So, how is your race going? Have you remembered that there is a great crowd of witnesses cheering you on? Is there anything you need to do to get back in the right lane? Have you remembered that Jesus is there to support and carry you when you need it? Life is probably more like a triathlon or a marathon than a sprint, but we don't run it alone. We have others alongside us. What could you do to cheer someone else along this week? We have the example of others who have gone before us to encourage us. Who can you think of that has inspired you? Someone well known or someone you know personally? What about them can inspire you now with where you're at? And most importantly, we have Jesus cheering us on. Jesus who has already demonstrated his great love for us through the sacrifice he made for us. May we always be grateful and inspired by that example, support and love that he has given us. Amen.